Welcome to the WAVY Digital Desk. After the news of the Titan submersible last week, we're learning more about deep sea exploration. What does it take to prepare for a dive, and what is it like to participate and be on a submersible deep in the ocean? We're learning about this and more this afternoon at the WAVY Digital Desk. Hi, I'm Sarah Goode. Thanks for joining us this afternoon now. We're going to be talking about submersibles, and we have Fred Dobbs, Professor and Chair of Ocean and Earth Sciences at Old Dominion University, here with us. He's been on numerous dives on different submersibles in his career, including the Pisces 5, the Alvin, and Johnson Sea Link. WAVY's Michelle Wolf spoke with him yesterday. That article and more is linked in the Facebook description if you want to check that out. And we're going to speak in a little bit more detail today about what it really is like to participate on these submersible trips, what they were doing, the research that he did, and more. So I'm going to bring Fred on now. Fred, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Sarah, for the invitation.
Absolutely. To start, I'd just love to hear a little bit about, what led to you being on these trips. What was your background at the time? You've had a very interesting career, it seems, from all the dives, and then now as the professor and chair at Old Dominion. But if you just could share a little bit about, maybe some of your background and what got you involved in some of these dives.
The answer to that goes to the Wayback Machine, indeed, because it was a wonderful teacher in the 5th grade. My father was in the Navy. We were stationed in Hawaii. And Miss Takano took us to the beaches and to the tide pools. We had aquaria in the classroom. She was a great and inspirational teacher. And I pretty much decided at that point that I was going to become a marine scientist. I'm not sure that I would have used that particular description at the time, but I knew it was something to do with that. And I truly never looked back. And so I got a degree in biology, a master's degree in zoology. I did a lot of invertebrate zoology at the time. I took some time out to work for industry, and I was a gentleman scientist for a year in Denmark. I came back to the United States, got my PhD, and my second postdoc, that is the professional research assignment that we have subsequent to getting a PhD, was at the University of Hawaii. And it was there where I was entrained into the program that Dr. Dave Carl was running. And oh yeah, there's some photos I recognize. It's the work that he was doing was at the next Hawaiian island. It's called Loihi Seamount, although I have just learned in preparation for this talk that less than 2 years ago, it was renamed. It's now the Kamehuakanaloa Seamount. And so it's gone from one Hawaiian word to a more appropriate Hawaiian word. At any rate, it's south and east of the Big Island. And there, as the eruptions occur on this undersea volcano, what we call a seamount, it's gradually accreting, and the guesstimates are that sometime between 10 and 50,000 years from now, the next Hawaiian island will rise above the surface as more and more lava accumulates. Well, there's a lot of interesting microbiology going on in this, around a place where the lava, or more correctly, really the hot water is coming up. It's not nearly as hot as the great images that we see on National Geographic or NOVA of the high temperature hydrothermal vents. This is more on the order of 5 degrees centigrade, so just be too chilly to swim in, but it's still a little bit warmer than the water around it. And the bacteria that are around there were what was of interest to Dave Carl and his students, and I jumped into that program and made some contributions of my own. And so in the course of that, I got to go on these dives on the Pisces 5. Yeah.
And for anyone viewing, we'll show at least an image, I believe, of the Pisces 5 that will pop up, via AP photo. But, can you tell us what that vessel is like? I think, people have a varying idea of, the size and the shape. I mean, what is, at least that first one, Pisces 5, what was that like to be on?
Yeah, it's, of course, we don't go out to the study site in that particular
Mm-hmm.
vessel. Instead, there's a mothership, a tender ship, some people call it. And that's the basis of what is the launch. In the old days, when I was there, this was back in the mid 19, and in fact, early 1990s, I should say. The Pisces was towed on a barge behind the mothership, and so to get into the Pisces, we would get into a Zodiac from the mothership, and then run back a couple hundred meters, and then get on board. So it looks when the picture pops up again, you'll see that it looks a bit like a guppy, sort of a big fat fish with a big belly. But in fact, most of what you see there is the mechanisms whereby it goes up and down in the water, the propellers that move it, and there's superstructure of different sorts. But really, the crucial part for the people is buried in there. It's a sphere about 6 feet in diameter. So people with long arms, stretch your arms out, and that's about 6 feet. And so we climbed down through a hatch into that area, and then sort ourselves out on the couches that were down below. I say couches, it makes it sound much more luxurious than in fact it was. It was a hard bench with a cushion on it. And then the divers who were helping us out would close the hatch, batten it down, and the pilot would make sure we were okay on the inside. And then the barge would be dropped down to about 60 feet, some round numbers, 20 meters. The divers would unhook the submersible, and it would fly off the barge and then start to descend into the ocean. And then we reverse the process to come back. Since I left the University of Hawaii, it became a more traditional submersible launch where a different ship with a big crane would drop, I should say, gently lower the submersible into the water, and the process would then take place. So no raft involved at that point.
And in terms of depth, I mean, how far are you going down into the ocean there?
For the Loihi seamount work, it was about 1,200 meters, and sometimes just 1,000 meters. The reason it's so variable is that every once in a while this volcano would blow its top and lose a lot of what it had accreted over time, with the result that the depth would sometimes be different when we went. Yeah, there she is.
Right.
Yeah.
And then, on a personal level, I mean, I imagine this was your first experience diving, correct, in submersibles with the Pisces. I mean, what was that like for you, to be offered that to be a part of your research there? Was it scary at all? Were you worried about going to those depths? I mean, was that just a normal part of the job?
Well, certainly wasn't normal on the first dive. It was very fun, very exciting, and very cold as it turns out. So let me explain what I mean by that. Most of the ocean is cold, dark, and deep. What we swim in, and even what we scuba dive in, the deepest divers are scuba divers, at least at the sports level, are going down to maybe 120 feet, let's call that 40 meters. But remember that the Loihi seamount was a little more than 1,000 meters, and the average depth of the ocean is about 4,000 meters. Of course, the deepest part of the oceans are 10,000 meters. So we are really, what we recreate in is just the smallest sliver of what is the ocean. And most of that ocean is below the point at which sunlight can penetrate. So it's dark. And it's also cold. In the absence of that sunlight that warms it, it has a low temperature. 2 to 4 degrees is the temperature of most of the ocean. So back to the sub, when we dive into the depths where it's cold, there's only so much battery power, and they're certainly not going to use it on keeping us warm. And instead, that battery power is needed to turn on lights so we can see outside. That battery power is needed to run fans. That battery power is needed to run the propeller, et cetera, et cetera. And so the cold seeps into the hull. And while we started out in t-shirts and shorts, after a while, we're putting on first set of sweats, and some of us, I was a skinnier kid then, some of us would have to put on a second pair of sweats. The great thing is at the end, we would come up in a very cold sphere, pop open the hatch, and all of a sudden it's 85-degree humid ocean weather. Well, I'm an oceanographer that doesn't necessarily do well in waves. So we've gone from this very gentle gliding in the absence of waves down 1,000 meters below the surface, and all of a sudden we're bouncing around on this raft, and I'm in sweats, and then the hot, humid air is coming in. So I was always the first one out of the hatch because I'd get out, hang on for dear life, and half the time would lose my lunch.
Yes.
But that notwithstanding, it was still very, very exciting. We going down, and where very few people have ever been, of course, and very fortunate, very lucky to be able to do that, and collect samples that we ended up, of course, working on for years, in some cases, in the laboratory.
And how are you collecting those samples? I mean, we've seen different photos, throughout this presentation of, submersibles, but are there arms? What's the way that the vessel collects those?
There's a lot of different ways that different submersibles do things. Yes, there are arms. In the old days, it used to be, we would call it T-handle technology. That is, the robot arm could easily take a T-handle and turn it 90 degrees. So it could essentially put a stopper in and collect water, or grab that handle and plug it into the sediment and pull up a plug of sediment that could, and then everything would go into a basket of some sort. And even the lid could be closed. We'd pick up rocks and put them into the basket as well. And when we get back up to the surface and the scramble is on, remember these things have been living at cold temperatures, and not ever seeing sunlight. So the scramble is on to get them in the ship's refrigerator, or walk-in refrigerator, I should say, to return them to at least their ambient temperature, certainly not the ambient pressure. So there's also some submersibles that have giant slurp guns, and with those they can slurp up fish or zooplankton of different sorts. Those are and now we're looking at the Johnson Sea Link there. Yeah. Okay.
With the device, I guess that's a device, that puts it down into the water.
That's right. That's what you're seeing is the business end of a big crane that's off the ship. Yeah. Yeah. Are you able to stop those?
Yes,
photos?
I can.
And next time the Johnson Sea Link shows up, we could segue.
Yeah,
to
absolutely.
That.
One question I did want to ask, before we dive into some of these other, submersibles and experiences, could you just talk about, how important this deep sea exploration is? I think there's a lot of discussion right now about what you're seeing and what you're viewing, but, in terms of bringing these samples back, in terms of the work you're doing, it is really important to progress science, correct? To view what's down there, to understand bacteria or sediment or whatever the project was.
Yeah, or the organisms living in the bones of dead whales. We might get around to that too. That was my Alvin dive. Yeah, it's remarkable when you start looking in places where you've never looked before, and that's a truism not just for the ocean, but perhaps for the galaxy and indeed the universe. But we haven't had until the last 50 years, the ability to go deep into the ocean and do anything meaningful with people aboard, and the people coefficient is a really important part of the equation here. We can do things and see things that until very recently we didn't have the camera equipment to be able to see. And we can make decisions on the fly that can't necessarily be made by someone who can't see the entire environment. And it's what's great now and greatly facilitates, whether it's a search for a lost submersible or whether it's trying to explore the ocean, are what we call ROVs, remotely operated vehicles, and we also have AUVs, autonomous underwater vehicles, and whether they are tethered to a mothership or not, they have, especially in that case, but even with the autonomous vehicles, we can go places in the absence of a human factor that makes it easier to explore places that potentially are dangerous or hazardous for one reason or another. How important is it? It's really important. I love to make the case, maybe all oceanographers do, that we know much more about the surface of the moon and the surface of Mars than we do the bottom of the ocean. We simply have had many more cameras and eyes and telescopes on every square meter of the moon, including the dark side of the moon, the side we don't see, than we have for nearly all of the ocean. We do a pretty good job with what's in navigable waters, but for most of the ocean, which, as I said, is an average depth of 4,000 meters, we don't have that level of detail.
Right. And and you've also done dives, to segue in different oceans. You've been on the eastern seaboard as well as, being in Hawaii, and you've been in off the coast of Los Angeles as well. So, I mean, you've traveled different oceans to see, not just the Pacific, but and for different reasons. You said it was sediment, off the shelf of North Carolina, and then with the Alvin. I mean, do you want to talk a little bit about that, because that is the deepest depth, correct, that you've been is with the Alvin?
Yeah, and just to make clear, 1,200 meters is not that deep.
Yeah.
Every decade or so, Alvin gets reconfigured. Alvin, is a quick aside, Alvin is actually owned by the U.S. Navy. It's operated out of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. But every once in a while, they take the whole thing apart and put her back together. And when they do that, they also increase the depth to which it can travel. And I think after the latest refit, it's now good for 6,000 meters. And I was only at 1,200, so you can go a lot deeper. It takes longer, of course, to get down and longer to get back up. All right, to Alvin and the Grateful Dead Whale cruise, as we called it. So still at Hawaii, there was another professor, Craig Smith, who studied benthic ecology, studied the organisms that live in and on the sediments of the ocean, and he was on an Alvin dive in the Santa Catalina Basin, one of the basins off Los Angeles, and all of a sudden, just serendipitously, they encountered the skeleton of a whale that had died and fallen down to the sediment and had decomposed. So there was still a skeleton there. It was clearly recognizable as a whale skeleton. Well, Craig kept going back to that site, and I was able to accompany him on one of those dives. And that's when I did my Alvin dive. Alvin is configured in broadest of terms in a way similar to Pisces. There's a titanium hull into which a pilot and two scientists go. And we use the same set of arms and T sample technology to take sediment cores but instead of bringing rocks back, they're running rocks in the area, but there was whale bones. So we would put some whale bones into the basket and bring them back up. So it was those sediment samples that were the focus of his lab, as well as together with collaborators, the bacteria that were using as a food resource all the oil that is in whale bones. If you remember way back when, whalers used to boil down the bones to collect whale oil. So we used before kerosene came on the scene. So it was whale oil that we burned in our lamps. So this oil was oozing very slowly out of the bones, but there were some organisms that were actually burrowing into the bones to get the oil as a food resource. So this whale skeleton was an oasis of food in what is, for the most case, with most of the deep sea, a food desert, if you will. So what an incredible amount of organic matter deposited when a whale hits the bottom. So that was the Alvin cruise, and that was really great to be part of that effort. Again, that was I was fortunate enough to be invited by Dr. Craig Smith for that, and it is absolutely memorable.
And this is an earlier version of the Alvin. That's a photo. It's much more archive. But as Professor Dobbs said, you know, it does go through every 5 years a sort of upgrade. So now if you go look it up, it looks different, obviously, than this photo on your screen right here. But I think that's interesting, and then also a salute to them for, you know, continuing to upgrade it and find new technology, of course, that, you know, it's gone from this to whatever, you know, version it is now is pretty significant.
Yeah, and one of the reasons we want to do that is not just because we want to go deeper faster and explore more of the ocean, but the French Trieste goes deeper. The Japanese have some submersibles that go deeper. And I think there is some perhaps less than genteel international rivalry and competition here to have the technology to be able to send submersibles down even deeper.
Right. And, you know, I'll continue so we can talk about the Johnson ceiling too. So here are some photos.
Yeah, if you'll hold on that one.
Yeah,
if you
here we can see the sphere here. I mean, talk about, you know, the style. This one obviously looks very different from the other two that seem to be more contained.
Yeah, and this is employs the same technology. What your viewers are seeing at the moment is the front of a sphere, right? A sphere being the shape that evenly distributes the pressure around all equally around all portions of the sphere, and that is really the front of the submersible there. All the stuff you're seeing on the side of the arms and the motors, the propellers that drive it. So the sphere holds only the pilot and one scientist, but that plexiglass extends behind and indeed below. So it's a plexiglass sphere. And rather than being limited to a porthole or two, or what's being shown on the video camera, here the scientists can look all around and see everything. It's pretty wild, especially going down the initial plunge into the water. It's quite thrilling. That's the exciting thing, is you can see everything. The goofy thing is that the curvature of the sphere causes extreme distortion. So it's not clear how big things are. And the Johnson ceiling people figured that out pretty easily. So they shoot two laser beams that are 10 centimeters apart. And those are projected onto a fish, or those are projected onto the sediment, or a coral head, whatever they want to measure. And so they know when the photograph comes back that is 10 centimeters. So despite the distortion that is tough on our eyes, the laser beams keep us straight. So yeah, it's it was a wild ride in that for sure. A couple of trips. What is the disadvantage, if you will, of the plexiglass is that it can't go as deep. It's not as strong as a titanium sphere, as you sort of expect. So
Right.
it's not able to. It doesn't have a bottom depth anywhere near that of Alvin.
And in this submersible experience, I mean, you were only at, I think you said 150 meters in depth. So, so still lower, obviously, than you would on your own, but you know, a much more shallow. And in that instance, I mean, that was the depth of the seafloor, correct? Because you were collecting sediment. So at that point, it just hadn't become a deeper ocean shelf yet.
Yeah, just some slight terminology.
Yes,
So
please.
the continental shelf runs out to about 200 meters. We have a very wide continental shelf on the east coast of the United States. And in contrast, just because of the way the plates are moving, it's a very, very narrow continental shelf on the west coast. You can get out to the deep sea in a rowboat on the west coast. Here, you have to steam fast for quite some time to get out to what we call the shelf slope boundary, and that's approximately 200, 250 meters, where the relatively flat shelf starts to give way to the slope going down eventually to the abyssal plain.
So in terms of the ship that takes you out there, I mean, you do need that to be, that's a significant portion of, I guess, the travel out there is, you know, being on this ship as well.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And we were on the Cape Hatteras, which at the time, if I can remember correctly, was out of the University of Delaware. We were ODU scientists. There were scientists from other institutions. This is the way that much of the, I guess I should say, all of the U.S. oceanographic fleet works. Although there are some ships that are owned by the Navy, most of them are owned by the National Science Foundation. And it's the name of the organizing group, I should say the initials of the organizing group is UNOLS, UNOLS. And if you want to get on a ship, or especially if you want to use a sub, you need to make arrangements a year, 2 years in advance. It depends upon where that ship will be, what part of the ocean the ship will be in. And then your grant proposal to do the science has to be approved, and then you can get ship time. It's a complicated process. You just don't walk down one weekend and give the captain $500 and say, let's go fishing. So it's a very, very different arrangement. But back to 150 meters. So there was some light there. It's still shallow enough that there would be some diffuse sunlight, and so we were able to put together that, plus of course the big lights on the Johnson Sea Link to see the sediment features that we were after.
And then, you know, just getting into a little bit of that preparation. So you just told us about the grant, and then, you know, the process to actually make one of these trips. But in terms of, you know, participating, is there anything that they need from you, that they need to make sure you're aware of, that they want you to be okay with being in confined spaces? I mean, is there any of that language that's thrown around before you actually get on the submersible?
Not really, but it's not, you don't go diving right away. What happened in the case of the Pisces and also the Alvin is that the pilot invites the scientists to come on board the night before, and then you go down and the pilot says, this is the CO2 scrubber, and this is how you change the filter. Here's the button that lets you turn on the camera. This will illuminate the port side of lights. This is the starboard side lights. And so you go through a checklist. The pilot, I learned after the fact that the pilot is also looking at you to see how you're doing with 3 people in a 6-foot sphere. And if you're looking interested in taking notes, that's good. If you're sitting there in the fetal position sweating, you're probably not a good candidate to spend 8 hours or more in the submersible. And happily, I passed the test in both cases. There's and this has some overtones perhaps for the recent disaster with Titan, but in the case of Alvin and Pisces, there is a plan Z43. It's never been exercised, but it's possible for the pilot to push some buttons, and as I understand things, there are explosive bolts that jettison everything except the sphere itself. Sorry, let me rephrase that. It jettisons everything away from the sphere, such that the sphere, which is inherently positively buoyant, will rise to the surface. And so while it would be very unclear which end is up, in an extreme emergency, the superstructure would be left behind and the sphere would be able to rise. So we were told that in our indoctrination meeting as well. Yeah.
And then, in terms of diving deeper, perhaps, than you have, whether that is through, a private, tour, if you will, or in terms of research, I mean, I'm sure you are interested in seeing other parts of the ocean, but is that something that you would do now as more of a tourist, or is that something that you sort of see as, a pause, and maybe that is perhaps just for science purposes?
Yeah, I think that I would be, I'd go tomorrow if I could get on board a research institution's submersible. These are, whether U.S. or Canadian or French or Japanese, these are obliged to go through safety inspection, pressure tests. They have to be certified by a maritime certification board. That's a bit redundant. And that unfortunately was not the case with Titan, at least as I read in the newspapers. I'm Will Rogers here. All I know is what I read in the newspaper. But I would, therefore, anything that was touristic would be of concern to me in the absence of the strong certification that's on essentially the other side of the fence, the academic side of the fence. And Michelle and I talked about this a little bit yesterday. I think the idea of tourism in the ocean is a fine one, and let's forget about what vehicle you're in at the moment. I think that's a fine one, but with sites that are sites of tragedy, such as the Titanic, I'm not sure that should be a tourist destination. We've seen enough in images and videos. I think it's I'm going to quote myself here. If we don't treat it reverentially, we should at least treat it respectfully. And I think for a place like that, or it would be best to just leave that alone. There's a lot more interesting natural sites to be seen in the ocean, and let's go there instead if we're just talking tourism.
Right, between, whether it's a reef or somewhere that has different sea life or organisms or so forth. I mean, is that what, I guess, interests you then? Seeing something as to, I mean, I don't know if you'd go down to the Mariana Trench, but we've heard a lot about that, from James Cameron and everything in the last week or so. But, there are certain things in the ocean down there as well. I think some people have, maybe the view that you all are seeing things through, the porthole or through your camera all the way down. But, to get to those depths, I mean, there's certainly other places in the ocean where you can go and see other sea life. But I mean, you're not seeing anything until you get down there and the lights turn on. So, I mean, it's a pretty long journey to get all the way down there.
Yeah, it is. There's sometimes a little bit of a light show, and this is just naturally bioluminescent organisms that may bump into the porthole, or uh, and the anglerfish. We've all seen pictures of those with the uh, little bioluminescent worm, but on the other end of that extension is a fish with very, very big jaws. And so when another fish comes up to take a look at that worm, it quickly becomes dinner for the angler fish. Yeah, yeah. I never have seen one of those except on television.
And we've covered a lot, and it's really interesting just hearing about your experience, and I'm sure there's so many other details that you could speak of like your numerous dives. But I mean, is there anything that I guess has stuck with you? I mean, whether it's something between your research or it's something that you've seen on a dive that to this day, you think of as such an important part of your career.
Well, the dives were as I tried to make clear earlier in my career, but they certainly gave me an idea about ocean processes that I don't think I would have simply from book learning, that I wouldn't have simply from looking at videos. It wasn't really at all in my case exploration. We were going down. We knew where we were going. We were going down to get samples of bacteria or of sediment or whale bones. So it wasn't looking at new places, but they were new to me, and there's always a big kick because of that. It's just that so rather than the thrill of exploration, it was really the thrill of taking samples that we would then analyze in the laboratory, as I said, for months and years thereafter, and figuring out a little bit more about how nature operates. That's what really drives me as a scientist. How does nature operate? And we talk about putting a brick or two into the wall of science's understanding of nature. I'm still working on those bricks, and would love to go down in a sub again if that opportunity would present itself.
And hopefully your students know what a wealth of, experience and research that you have. But, is there anything that you say to them? Are any of them interested in that field to do, research on submersibles? Is that something that you sort of, suggest to people if they want to be in oceanography?
I tell them that there's the opportunity to do that. You have to be in the right place at the right time. A sad note to these stories that I've been telling is that the funding for the Pisces 5 has dried up. She's on land, and I understand that's the same thing with the Johnson Sea Link as well. Alvin is going strong as ever, but the expense associated with submersible operations is great, and decisions have been made. And it's sad because then there's a method, there's a technique, there's a way of exploring the ocean that isn't available to them at the moment. We hope they can come out of mothballs, but then again, I'm not in charge of their budgets. Is there? I don't encourage students specifically to try to do sub work. I encourage students to try to do the best science they can. My style is pretty much to have them pick their project. They're not picking projects in Hawaii when we're here in Norfolk, Virginia. What a pity. But it's more homegrown projects here, local ones. Although if I can quickly say that many of my colleagues here are studying around the world. We've recently had, in the last several years, we've had scientists at the North Pole, down in the Southern Ocean off Antarctica and every place in between. ODU, oceanography, and is tremendously broad for the relatively small faculty we have here. It's tremendously broad in its approaches to looking at scientific problems around the world.
Absolutely. And I think, that speaks to your background as well. But I think it's great to know that, locally here, while we have our own, bodies of water and oceans, that you all are bringing in knowledge, a wealth of knowledge from, other places around the globe. I think that's fantastic. Well, Fred, I think that, that covers it. And I think, people tuning in, I don't know if anyone has any other questions while we have the expert here, but, I think it just really is nice to put some information towards, this topic that has been, unfortunately in the news for, over a week now. But I think just to know, what the research side of it is, and to know what these vessels look like and how they operate is very fascinating.
Great. Well, happy to tell some stories and provide some insight to you and your audience.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And if you're tuning in now or watching this later, more information is available on WAVY.com. And you can also check out Michelle Wolf's coverage from yesterday as well. So thank you so much, Professor Dobbs, for joining me today. And thank you for watching.
Thank you very much.